if you are an employee network that's about to go through a rebrand and you've been thinking about what to call yourselves, as in should you even use the term ERG or BRG, then this video is for you. You'd be surprised actually how many people I reach out to and say, are you still involved with ERGs, which I often do. And some people say, what is an ERG? So, and I have done a different video about that. But if you are thinking about whether to use the term ERG, BRG, or something else, then this video is for you. Yes, I have been talking about this quite a lot with a current client. I'm actually not massively wedded to different names. I'm just going to put it out there, right? But this comes up quite a lot, and some people are feel it's quite important for all of their different colleague groups to have a name. So that's what this video is going to get into. I'm going to get into what is an ERG very, very briefly, how it's different to a BRG. I've even heard BERG, Berg. Some people use the term ERG anyway. So I'm going to get into that. I'm going to talk about other names as well that I hear, and some of the challenges, and maybe why I think that it's less about the name, but more about what you do. So that's what I'm going to get into today. This is ERG Strategy, the channel that brings you tips, tools, advice, etc., so that you can build and sustain engaged, effective employee communities and groups that really make a difference in your workplace. So if that's what you are here for, you are in the right place. So let's get into it. I tell you what, so new videos every week, right? And I'm trying my best. Do you know what the thing is? I don't actually often work from home. I know that sounds bizarre because obviously I work for myself. I'm primarily by myself. I do work with associates as well, and I have a VA for people that know me. But often when I'm working from home, I actually often go to the local Starbucks. Don't judge me. That's where I find that I feel most productive. And so it's not often that I'm at home with a full face of makeup on, ready to record a video. However, this morning I had an at-home meeting that required a full face of makeup and a shirt collar, which you don't often see me in. And I thought, do you know what? Let me record a video, right? So no notes. And I went onto vidIQ, which if those of you in the world of YouTube know, you know. And here we are. Now I'm going to, this is what vidIQ suggested people want to find out about, the difference between an ERG and a BERG. So ERG, Employee Resource Groups. I've done a whole video about what is an employee resource group, but very briefly, it's where colleagues come together, colleagues, employees, staff, whatever you want to call them. And that does have bearing potentially on the name, but effectively, when this happens organically, people that work together come together and maybe they feel like they are the only blank in the organisation. And so they want to come together, pull people together that maybe share the same lived experience and potentially share similar experiences in the organisation. Typically, these came about, as a result of inequality or inequities or unfair treatment in the workplace. This is their origin, but really they branched out much wider than that now. But it's really groups of colleagues coming together thinking there's a gap in terms of our experience of this organization, and there's a gap in terms of the policies or the processes or how this company works and how it treats individuals that are like us, right? And so these colleagues come together and see how they can make things better, how they can make the world of work a better place. That's typically the origins of employee resource groups, right? And that's sometimes where it stops. In fact, it sometimes just stops at should we get together and have a moan, or should we get together and have a cupcake, or get together and put on an event and put some rainbow flags up or something like that, right? That's if I was being completely cynical. So for some people, it just stops at, let's just get people together. Let's just get this sense of community. And I talk about sometimes different levels of maturity. And so you have that first level of maturity, which is just, let's get people together, right? There will be a link below, by the way, to my free maturity score if you want to give that a go and assess where your ERG is, and you'll get a whole report on all of that malark. Totally free. It's in the link below. So that's an ERG. A BRG, Business Resource Group. The main difference, I'll tell you a story actually about one that I came across that actually wasn't called an ERG or a BRG, but when I describe it, you might see why it's more of a BRG than an ERG. So it was in an organisation, it was actually called the Culture Cafe. Culture Cafe? Was it World Cafe? Language Cafe. Neither of the first two. It was called the Language Cafe. And it was a global organization that is headquartered in the UK. Very global, as in one or two of their key accounts were not based in the UK. They're actually French. So hence the link between language, right? You'll see. So one of their main customers is a French or large French organization. And so they had an ERG that was called the Language Cafe. And how it first started, because I actually did a LinkedIn Live with the lead. So if you go back through my LinkedIn Live, you don't have to go back really far, because I'm going to say it was like at least 18 months ago. But she was basically explaining how it first started. So it was typically for, I guess you would call expats, right, that have come to the UK, whose first language is not English, right? So they came together to share just, I guess, really things about cultural heritage, maybe things about like moving to the UK, but just sort of sharing culture. That's probably why I thought it was called Culture Cafe. It wasn't. It's called Language Cafe. But they were coming together to share things about like culture and like moving to the UK and just like sharing things about heritage. And then because there are a lot of foreign language speakers, and this organization, as I say, is global with lots of key accounts, major customers who operate business in different languages in different countries, etc., that speak different languages. They started turning it into a language cafe, and they started sort of almost just doing like they maybe do like basic French, because their main customer is French, or basic, X, Y, and Z. So they started doing a little bit of that. And then they also found that people in the business were going to them when they needed documents reviewing. So they were doing, for example, translating documents into, say, French or Italian or Spanish or whatever language, and they needed somebody to check the translation over that was a native speaker. They might go to the Language Cafe and ask if somebody there could translate a document for them. So interestingly, I remember when I was describing this ERG to somebody else, and they were like, that's not an ERG, that's a BRG. In fact, I think what they basically said was, that sounds more like business resources that should be paid for, as in they should be paying somebody for it. There's a whole nother video that I've done around paying people for their time writing ERGs. But effectively what you can see, and that this Language Cafe is perhaps an extreme example of it, but it's where the focus of the group is really more around a business objective, right? Business imperative, strategic business objective, etc. That's what tends to put it more towards being a business resource group, and particularly if there is any sort of like commercial link. So if it's driving operational performance and it's driving the bottom line, then it will be classed as a business resource group. Now, if you've watched much of my content, and certainly if you've seen the report that we put out right at the end of 2025, and then we did a webinar on it at the start of 2026, the reality is, in this here current climate, a lot of organizations, especially if they are for-profit organizations, they're saying, we haven't got time for anybody to be doing anything that doesn't contribute to business performance or doesn't contribute to business strategy. And that doesn't mean that everything has to have a pound sign attached to it, because some of this could be, as I bumped into an award-winning ERG lead last week out at dinner. And, she made the point of saying some of the things that ERGs actually often affect and that you see straight away when the ERG isn't working effectively is things like sickness absence, right? Retention rates and things like that. And so they may not instantly and sort of like directly impact the bottom line, but they do have an impact on the performance of the business. So if you've watched me enough, and if you've listened to or downloaded any of our reports or listened to the webinar, you will know that in this day and age, in 2026, people want ERGs that are absolutely aligned with business strategy. And actually, I talk about moving ERGs into the space where they are seen as strategic assets of the business, right? The days when people could just come together just to create community or just to raise awareness or just to have cupcakes, those days are gone, long gone, absolutely long gone. So I would argue that there really should be no distinction in 2026 between ERGs and BRGs. I just think, let me caveat that. Let me caveat that, right? Let me not be so black and white. Let me be a little bit more nuanced. I think for most organizations in most countries, I'm going to keep the US separate for now. I think that there isn't really a distinction. I think that ERGs should really have that objective of aligning to what is important for the business. And that is how time should be used, right? It should both benefit individuals, colleagues, employees, but it also should benefit either the business as in the organization and or the wider community or society or the planet, right? Whatever it be, right? I think that ERGs just have to look a bit more broader. The reason that I sort of just want to caveat that very slightly is I'm conscious that in some countries, and I'm going to put the US in this bracket as well, um, things are a little bit wild, right? Things are just a little bit crazy. And the reality is the origins of ERGs were around social justice and civil rights. And I don't want to forget that. And I feel like if you are in an ERG in a country or by nature of the type of ERG, where actually some of what you're doing is a little bit of that struggle around social justice and kind of like human rights and equality, and you have the backing of your organization to be more in that space, and so you're at a place where you're like, we're not interested in the B of Business Resource Group. We are 100% an employee resource group. I'm like, I completely understand. I completely understand because of where we are. The one thing I would say though, and the reason I said, have you got almost like the backing from your organization to operate in that space? Because I think that's what's needed. Because as I sometimes say, as leaders of ERGs, when you are sort of like recognized in that space and you're given resources, so you're given time, you're given resources, etc., to manage and to deliver a budget, you have to make sure that you're doing like what you've got permission to do, if that makes sense, right? You will be held accountable by the organization. So if your view is, if you're in a country, for example, like the US, where you're like, you know what, in 2026, really this ERG needs to focus on the needs and the well-being of the employees and less so on alignment with the business, that's absolutely fine. I would say as long as you get your sponsor on board, like get your exec sponsor totally bought into that and recognizing that that's where you are playing for now, right? Because of the current environment. So that's what I want to say about that, ERGs versus BRGs. And they are sometimes called, as I said in the intro, they're sometimes called BERGs. I don't know why. Maybe somebody thinks that BRGs just sounds too like commercial, too hard edged, right? So that's ERGs, BRGs. What are some of the other names that I sometimes hear? I just want to talk about them and maybe why they're less popular. So staff networks. I mean, there's even like a staff network day. I'm really surprised. I'm really surprised that that term. So here's the thing, especially if you're watching this in the US, staff is a word that I remember, I want to say like 20 years ago at least, staff became like not very popular as a word to describe people that work in an organization. But it seems to have stayed in certainly in the UK public sector. And so in the UK public sector, the term that's often used for ERGs is staff networks or staff networks if you're posh, right? So staff networks is definitely a terminology that is still used in the UK. And as I say, there is a day, which I'm going to say I think was last week or the week before, which was Staff Networks Day, right? So staff networks is a term. Again, I would say I would still be encouraging staff networks to be thinking about impact. Somebody asked me last week what I saw as the main differences between public sector and private sector employee resource groups, staff networks, whatever you want to call them. And my view, and this is based on working with quite a few public sector clients and obviously more private sector clients, is that staff networks, perhaps as their name suggests, tend to be focused more on things that I think fall actually more in the bracket of like employee relations rather than like value add. That's just kind of like my perception. So yeah, staff networks is a term. Other terms that I hear, I've heard colleague networks. There's a large UK organisation that I know of that uses that term. Other organisations, employee-led networks. You know, there's a large company I know that uses that term. And then one of the things that I really like actually that I don't see enough organisations doing when you're doing a rebrand. So if you are doing a rebrand, one of the things that I actually quite like is employee networks or employee resource groups where they sort of take the name of the organisation and they kind of somehow weave it into the name of the employee resource group. That I really like, and I as I always say, one of my very favourite, very favourite. Well, actually, there's a second one now. One of my very favourite ERGs is the LGBTQ plus ERG at Amazon, which is called Glamazon, which I just think is like the best. Well, I did think it was the best until I was talking to somebody last week at King's College NHS Trust in the UK, and their LGBTQ plus. It's always the LGBTQ ones that are very creative. Their LGBTQ plus network is called Kings and Queers, which I absolutely love. So I love that when somebody when all of the networks. I think you kind of you sort of have to have all of the networks do it. I feel rather than one. I know sometimes we get things like women at women at Asians at yeah, that can work, with an at sign, whatever. But yeah, I think I prefer those actually. So I'm not wedded to whether networks do or don't have ERG or BRG or whatever name at the end of it. I really am not fussed, right? I don't want to say I don't care because that sounds like I don't. But what I would say is the most important thing is what are you actually doing? What is the network doing? And I want to share with you because I want to really encourage you to go and have a look at the report that we produced. I thought I should have really had these notes ready. The report that we produced at the start of the year around impact and why impact is so important. Because I had an email from somebody about the report, and it really sort of like blew me away. And this is why I say it almost doesn't matter what the thing is called. Now, I had this email from somebody who was a co-chair of a parents and carers network. Nothing in terms of whether it's an ERG or a BRG, none of that. It doesn't matter. So what he wrote me a lovely email and said, thanks for the brilliant report. It had a big impact on me as a relatively new co-chair of our parents and carers network. I'm working with my co-chair to shift our focus away from a high number of events to more impactful work for our network. For example, doing a full-scale review of our family-friendly policies and speaking to our policy team to try and incorporate changes based on network feedback. We've also been hosting quarterly dedicated community support meets, e.g. working dads, parents and carers of neurodivergent family members, etc., which gives us a chance to support each other and offer feedback. One of the big takeaways has been talking to organisations that could help with more focused line manager training for those managing parents and carers. All in all, your report had a massive impact on our ERG strategy for the year, and hopefully it'll help us drive positive impacts for our network. Thanks again. So there's the thing. Then their network isn't even called, it's not even called an ERG or a BRG or a this or a that, but they're doing the do, right? They're focusing on impact. So if you haven't downloaded that report, you can get it on ergleader.com on the resources page. It's the ERG ERG report for 2026, enabling effective ERGs. So please do go ahead and download that. I hope this was useful in terms of just talking through the difference, but also talking through why you maybe shouldn't get so hung up necessarily about the name. It's actually more about the content of what you're actually doing. So hope you found that useful. If you did, please share this, particularly maybe share it with your sponsor or who might be thinking about the rebranding. Maybe it might be your marketing team or somebody in your DEI team. Please share this with them if it's something that they are thinking about. I hope that was useful. I will see you next week with another video, or I will see you live on the LinkedIn Live Friday morning, 8:30 UK time, every Friday. See you then. Take care. Go with grace.